You're listening to the New Heroes of Old novelcast, written and read by author Greg Bulmash. Season 1, Hell on $5 a Day. Episode 14. Chapter 14. Tracking the Prey. "Bouncing Beelzebub," Karen whispered. "You're alive." "Yeah?" George dropped his pack on the floor of the boat. "So?" "Pardon my friend," Alain said, distracting Karen. "He's not the most polite individual." He gave George a glare that caused George to lower his head, leaving Alain to deal with the boatman. "Have you seen any other living people recently?" he asked, dropping a roll of quarters into Karen's hand. Karen looked at the roll, whistled appreciatively, and pocketed it. "Yeah, I took one across 9 degrees downriver about 5 hours ago. Was he with anyone? An undead person like myself, perhaps?" Karen kicked the motor into gear, turning the boat away from the rocks and toward the fog. "No, he was alone. Got a vampire in the boat, crossing about the same place he did right now." "Right now?" George said incredulously. "But you're here. That's physically impossible." "Do you have any idea where you are?" Karen asked. George shut up and Alain sat down as Karen headed toward the fog. Alain was relieved. Kurt had escaped Vinny and had a 5-hour head start on him. He and George had come out a 40th of the way around the first circle from where Kurt had crossed. From his research, that would put Kurt about 27 miles downriver. It would take him a few hours to make that kind of distance on his own. A day with George tagging along. He'd have to hope that Kurt had enough wits about him to find a place to lay low. Rather than risk the trouble involved with walking into the town, Alain and George headed down the riverbank in the direction Karen had pointed. As there was no day or night, Alain told George to just call stops when he needed a rest. Alain, too, would need a rest, eventually. He wasn't a machine, but he could go farther than George. It had been a couple of years since George had served, but he was humping it like he was born to carry a pack. In 5 hours, they made 13 miles, which was a brisk pace considering that George was carrying a pack that weighed about a third as much as he did. Of course, some of that weight was redistributed every time they stopped for a drink, and some of it was left behind every time they had a latrine break. At that 13-mile point, Alain called for a halt for a meal break and some power napping. George had napped in the afternoon, so he'd be 100% for the ceremony, and Alain had slept all day. But after the brawling, the running, the planning, the packing, and now 8 hours of hiking, he could see that George had fumes in the gas tank. 2 hours to eat and nap would make sure that George was at least functional for another few hours. George slowly lowered himself to the ground. Alain opened one of the packs and pulled out a bottle of water, a Gatorade packet, and one of George's special field bars that were basically a serving of a paste of smooth peanut butter, salt, sugar, dried milk powder, and Irish sea moss powder stuffed inside a sugar cookie shell. They delivered 600 easily digestible calories, electrolytes, and vitamins in a small package. George had created them for his monthly camping trips because he said normal sports bars always left him feeling hungry. "Thanks," George said, opening the bottle of water and dumping the Gatorade powder in. They'd packed a dozen 700-milliliter bottles each, nearly a third of their pack weight being water. A person normally needed around a liter a day, but with the amount of exercise they were getting, George was going to need closer to 3. At that pace, they'd go through their water in 6 days, 5 if Alain used any for himself. Alain didn't sweat, meaning he just needed enough water to help break down and wash out the food he ate, plus a little to prevent cottonmouth and general dryness, maybe a bottle a day. He didn't need to eat, though. He got no benefit from it in terms of sustenance and power. But eating remained a comfort thing for Alain, even after all this time. His taste buds still functioned, perhaps even more acutely than before, and Marie had been such a good cook. George finished his bar, and what he didn't drink from the bottle he poured into his canteen. Alain handed him the sleeping mat, and George lay down on the grass, resting his head on it. He was asleep quickly, his breathing and heartbeat slowing. Those were the only sounds Alain heard. As close as the town was, no sound carried down the hill from it, and no one came out to investigate. Alain didn't suspect any trouble from it anyway. If Dante had been correct, the residents were good people, virtuous souls who hadn't had the opportunity to pledge their faith to God, or hadn't chosen to do so. Alain had a hard time believing that. The Bible had only arrived in some parts of the world recently. It just seemed unfair to be expected to play by rules you hadn't been told. A just God wouldn't condemn good people to hell, would he? On the other hand, what was just about being made a vampire against your will? Generally, Alain tried to believe in the no one can know what's in the mind of God philosophy. God was just and loving, and what Alain perceived to be unfair was just the part of God's plan that he couldn't understand. He had to believe that God made it all right in the end, that God did care, that God did love him. If he didn't believe that, this whole adventure was pointless. He pulled out his wallet. The older pictures of Marie, back when they'd newly come to the States, were in an album in a self-storage unit, protected against the elements, against the tattering that would come from carrying them around. But he had more recent ones. The one he looked at was from the 60s, and he'd laminated it to preserve it. She was 41 in the picture, as beautiful as the day he'd fallen in love with her. He saw the beginnings of gray in her hair, only the slightest sagging in her cheeks, the beginnings of smile lines around her mouth and eyes. Every smile line represented 10,000 laughs, and he felt like he could remember each one. Every one of her signs of age was earned from living, while he remained unchanged. The last 2 Thanksgivings had been tough. It was her favorite American holiday, and she'd laid down a spread every year that drew friends from miles around. Even at 85, you couldn't keep her out of the kitchen. After she died, everyone got together at Alain's and tried to throw a Thanksgiving party to make her proud. But it just wasn't the same. The next year they tried again. Most of them were so used to having Thanksgiving together they still wanted to, which, in a way, was a tribute to Marie and the friends she had gathered close. For Alain, he knew what was missing. The thing he was most thankful for was gone. Maybe it was silly, even sappy, but the song Who Wants to Live Forever from the Highlander soundtrack made him cry tearless sobs every time he heard it. Alain shook his head. He was only making himself morose. He had a lot of things to do before he could even get to heaven, and then you'd have quite a time getting permission to stay. He put the picture back in his wallet and put the wallet away. With the original plan, he'd have needed to be very lucky to succeed. But now, with George and Kurt complicating things, the odds against his success multiplied by 1,000. He'd just do his best and hope it was enough. It was all he had. Alain woke George after 90 minutes, and George made a few adjustments to his pack as they got ready to head out again. "Have you got a beat on Kurt yet?" George asked. Alain tried to sense Kurt. His human friends had loved playing hide-and-seek with him. Perhaps it was like throwing a ball for a dog, letting the tame vampire hone hunting skills he'd never need to use. But he'd become good at tracking people, sensing them. Of all the vampires he knew or knew of, he was the best tracker on either coast. He stilled his breathing and opened himself up, trying to pick up any sense of a human nearby. George was like a huge honking blip on his radar, but he was the only one. "No, we're still too far." George unstrapped the AR-15 from his pack and held the shoulder strap in his teeth as he slung the pack onto his shoulders. He unfolded the stock, checked the sights, chambered around, and flipped the selector to safe before slinging it over his shoulder for easy access. "You're not going to need that gun," Alain said. "We shouldn't encounter anything dangerous on this level." "You never know," George said, patting the AR-15. "And this thing packs a nice wallop. If I only knock 'em back a few steps, it could mean the difference between getting away and getting dead." Alain nodded. You've got a point, but fire as a last resort only. Treat these folks like civilians. I gotcha. They'd been walking for about 3 hours when Alain got his first sense of Kurt. He's on the move, he said, putting out an arm and stopping George. Where? Alain closed his eyes, expanding his senses, searching for the prey he sensed nearby, the beating heart like a sonar blip that smelled like a human. He's near the edge. He's not moving as fast as we are, but he's got a good lead on us. George took off running, but instead of running along the edge of town, he headed straight for the closest main street. Alain started after him. Where are you going? Alain shouted, speeding up to come even with George. We're not going to catch him in the first ring, George shouted. And if we go toward his street, we're just running 2 legs of a triangle. When we hit the edge, we'll be closer than if we followed his route, and we can start moving sideways again once we're in the second ring. Lead on, Alain said, shifting his pack, preparing for the long jog ahead of him. So, George said, peering down over the edge, no means of transport in sight. How do we get down? According to Phil, we jump, Alain replied, standing behind him, securing the AR-15 onto the pack. George looked down again, estimating the drop to be at least a mile, if not a little more, his stomach registering more than a touch of queasiness at the thought. You're shitting me. Nope, Alain said after pulling the strap tight, tying it off, then pulling on the rifle to test his knot. After you. George felt the backpack press against him with Alain's weight behind it, and then he was tumbling forward through space, beginning a mile-long dive toward the floor of the second ring. Wait, don't go yet. Please hit like and subscribe to encourage my behavior. Knowing people are reading or listening is what keeps me going. If you can't wait for the other episodes, check out the audiobook at bounce.ws/books. That's bounce.ws/BOOKS. And please visit bulmash.com for the latest updates on the novels, podcasts, and the journey from here to season 12. The New Heroes of Old Novelcast is read and produced by Greg Bulmash and distributed by Bulmash Media, LLC. Copyright 2026 by Greg Bulmash. Music is from the YouTube audio library. The opening music is Jungle by Akash Gandhi. The closing music is Better by Anno Domini Beats. Thanks for listening, and remember to come back soon.